The first Anzac Day dawn service I attended was as part of a silent vigil in 1969. The year before, a group known as the Committee for Vietnam Protest had caused considerable controversy by holding placards at the 1968 dawn service at the Cenotaph in Adelaide. The controversy had been momentarily substantial and involved some physical altercation. So it was with some diffidence that the General Committee of the Campaign for Peace in Vietnam discussed holding a vigil a year later. The decision to hold the vigil was both tactical and philosophical. The underlying philosophy of the vigil was for it to be a remembrance of all who died in wars, both soldiers and civilians. Apart from a single placard and lapel badges, there was to be no other signage displayed by the vigil team at the dawn service. Unlike the 1968 vigil, the 1969 event passed without incident, and at its conclusion, one of the officials from the dawn service came over and acknowledged the respectful nature of our small group. The decade of the 1960s was not only the time of the birth of the anti-Vietnam War movement, it had also been a time of social iconoclasm. Events like Anzac Day were not immune from critique. One such had been Alan Seymour's play, The One Day of the Year, which had premiered in Adelaide in 1960. That controversial play had been put on by an amateur theatrical group following a decision to exclude it from the program of the inaugural Adelaide Festival of Arts. In truth, Seymour's play was more about a complex father-son relationship than a defamation of what has been considered by some to be Australia's real national day. Understandably, however, the reaction at the time focused more on lines such as those shouted in anger by Alf Cook at his son Huey. "I'm a bloody Australian, mate, and it's because I'm a bloody Australian that I'm getting on the grog. It's Anzac Day this week. That's my day. That's the old digger's day." Back in the 1960s, I was not only involved in the anti-war movement, I was also a leader of the Adelaide University Pacifist Society, and had not long become a member of the Religious Society of Friends, known as Quakers. I classed myself as a Christian pacifist, and as such had been prepared to take on the national service system had my birthday come up in the annual conscription lottery when I turned 18. My youthful idealism had easy answers to complex problems of the world at the time. I certainly knew, and still hold that opinion, that the war in Vietnam was unjust, and not only that Australia should not have been involved, nor should it have sent conscripts to fight in it. Over the following decades, however, easy answers to complex problems no longer worked very well. The very fact of the annual commemoration of Anzac Day started to require some deep reflection on my own part, not only about the day itself, but about my involvement in it. Back in 1969, attending my first dawn service, I'd been against the war and Australian government policy that had dragged our country into it. Notwithstanding that I'd certainly not been against the soldiers who had been sent there, my participation that day had been a political statement. Why then, over subsequent years, would I attend dawn services almost every year from the late 1970s onwards, laying wreaths on many occasions, and in recent years, even presiding as the officiating clergy? In 2010, on the 25th of April, Anzac Day that year, the process of my reflection came to a head, and I felt forced to commit my thoughts to paper, and wrote about not only my views about Anzac Day, but indeed about my views in war in general and the pacifist response. In doing so, I sought to define a rationale for my own participation in frequent dawn services over those intervening years. On those occasions, no longer as a silent anti-war vigilist on the sidelines, but now as an active participant in the very event itself. The seminal message of my participation in the 1968 service, remembrance of all those who had died in wars, has continued as an underpinning of my subsequent participation over the decades. But the simplicity of that statement, the remembrance of all who have died in wars, soon became somewhat deficient in its application to both soldiers and civilians, and ignored a sentiment which grew within me in the subsequent decades: the concept of necessary conflict in response to awful circumstances. The proposition of remembering civilian victims of wars was unassailable, almost to the point of cheapness. Who could challenge a statement of such high moral ground rectitude that we should remember civilians killed in wars? While that flaw could not be allowed to dismiss its inclusion in the annual remembrance, it did insist that it too be subject to further reflection on my part, to delving behind the obvious. Over the years, such delving gave me some of the substance I sought, coming in the form of the changing nature of human warfare over the 20th and 21st centuries. Historically, and of course generalizing, the toll of civilian victims in major conflicts had been small in number compared to the tally of military deaths. However, towards the closing half of the 20th century, the situation had reversed, with the civilian toll exceeding the military. Sister Joan Chichester, an American nun writing in Women, Power and Peace in 2007, said, "At the turn of the 20th century, according to UNIFEM, the United Nations Development Fund for Women, civilian casualties accounted for 5% of the war dead. In World War I, the total number of civilians killed had climbed to 15% of the total wartime casualties. In World War II, civilians were 65% of the victims of war. And by the early 1990s, civilians were over 75% of the war dead. And now, today, here in our world, over 90% of those killed in war are civilians." At worst, using that dehumanizing war rhetoric of recent times, civilians moved from being collateral damage to being the focus of conspicuous terrorism, where higher tallies of non-combatants very much became an intentional instrument of war. The term conspicuous terrorism was first used in reference to the activities of rebel forces in Sierra Leone and Liberia, who determined that terrorizing civilians was more effective than traditional combat against armed opponents. Nor is technology immune from the charge. Machetes may have been the cause of high civilian deaths in Africa, but drone weaponry and suicide vests delivered 14 civilian deaths for every military one in Iraq, for example. So, remembrance of civilian victims of war remain for me an important call to say no to a seemingly inexorable trend in warfare. But what about the remembrance of dead soldiers? As I had stood at that 1969 dawn service, watching the wreath laying and observing those gathered for that purpose, I recall sensing the deep emotion of those participating and reflecting that what was being recalled by them was their bond with departed friends, but not just the ordinary friends of any life journey, but a special group with whom they had endured through warfare together, a group that shall not grow old as we who are left grow old. This brought the theme of heroism into consideration. Our word hero comes from the ancient Greek heros, which meant demigod. The original Proto-Indo-European word from which this derived was, it seems, ser, to protect and to watch over, from which, by a separate etymological journey, also comes our word serve. Even when I had been a pacifist, I had been convinced that those who had served in the forces had very often done so with a sense of service and in response to a calling to protect their community. And in so doing, very often displayed soaring heroism. I had no cause to doubt that the atrocities such as those at My Lai had been the exception, not the rule, in the behavior of soldiers. I therefore had no difficulty paying tribute to the heroism of those who had served. And that morning in 1969, as those who survived remembered those who had not, the full impact was more than just emotional. It was profound. There are scarcely more powerful words about this heroism of ordinary soldiers than those expressed by Kemal Ataturk in 1934, as he wrote of the dead Anzacs who had died at Gallipoli fighting the forces of which he had been the commander. He wrote, "Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnny and the Mermits to us where they lie side by side now here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well." Moving as his words were, what makes them more significant is that they name as heroes those who had been enemy combatants. Kemal Ataturk obviously had seen no contradiction to the idea of hero fighting hero. However, for me, as I tried to develop a rationale for necessary conflict, I needed to come to terms with the idea of there being heroes on both sides of a conflict. I could not figuratively just bury beyond the city walls the dead of the other side, of the enemy. But equally, how was I to deal with heroes who died for the indefensible? Of course, codes of war would help. Those who followed the Geneva Convention whilst fighting on opposing sides would merit consideration. More significant, however, for me, who had been a Christian pacifist, and was moving to a position of accepting situations of necessary conflict, was the question of how to deal with the concept of relative rightness of combatants, and if one side was transparently more defensible in its objectives than the other, how to rationalize the wrongness of war with the rightness of purpose. Back in 2010, I had read a statement by Aaron Taylor, author of Alone with the Jihadist, who wrote, "I have no illusions that pacifism is not always the most effective response to evil. Sometimes it may even get you killed. But it is the most faithful example of Jesus." Those words summed up my own theology on the subject of war. I had not been able to accept the concept of a just war, and yet undeniably, increasingly felt that there could be what I might describe as relative rightness in some conflicts. The Second World War, for example, and the Vietnamese-Cambodia War of 1979 as another. But my theology did not, and still does not, allow me to pretend that there could ever be a sense of Dieu et mon droit to conflict, of conflicts that would be blessed by God. Rather, I have developed a position which accepted the view that war could be regarded as more than just a failure of societal relationships, even indeed more than a failure in the attempt to live out God's economy. Rather, that it should be seen more fundamentally as a failure of faith. And as a failure of faith, our knelt prayer at times of reflection on conflict and its consequences should be the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus, forgive me, for I have sinned. In contrast, I've struggled with the opening phrase of this prayer, which is sometimes used at Anzac Day. "We give thanks to you, gracious God, for their great sacrifices in conflict and in captivity, for the cause of peace and freedom. In our nation of wealth, prosperity, and comfort, let us not forget the cost of these privileges which we now enjoy. We give thanks to you, gracious God, for their great sacrifices." To my mind, should that rather be, "Forgive us, God, that our brokenness has required such great sacrifices"? In other words, it seemed to me that our prayers should, in penitence, be that we grieve that circumstances have arisen that resulted in war, and that those circumstances called for terrible sacrifice on behalf of those who fought, as well as those around whom the conflict raged. Furthermore, that our prayers should be for the strength to proclaim a true gospel that never doubts the power of God, nor of his love for all his people, and that we may be able to acknowledge his promise in Jeremiah to prosper and not to harm us. In other words, what has been missing as collective humanity has been our faithfulness. But to return to the heroism commemorated on Anzac Day, It has long seemed to me that it is a heroism of innocence rather than triumphalism. Or, if there is any triumphalist sense, it is the triumph of the human spirit. In many ways, Anzac Day is more truly our national day because of this, and also because it names a date and a place of a failed battle and not a victory. And because of that, it has, as a mirror image of a Pyrrhic victory, delivered a much deeper sense of national identity than a stunning victory at Gallipoli could ever have done. America's national anthem was written in celebration of the US defense of Fort McHenry in the War of 1812. It is a soaring song that moves me every time I hear it. But we don't often hear the full anthem in this country. And amongst the words we don't hear are the closing refrains of the last verse, which is sung at formal occasions in the US. Praise the power that hath made and preserved us as a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause is just. And this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Our National Day, through its commemoration of a battle where immediate victory was denied, has been able to focus on the capacity of the human spirit to be heroic against the odds. We speak of mateship as an Australian characteristic, and that Gallipoli took it to an existential level. It is to be hoped that the resurgence over the past half-century in the support for Anzac Day activities, dawn services, marches, and other events of fellowship will always seek to reflect that. The philosopher Tim Suvatsane has written, "At its best, the Anzac legend isn't a narrow myth about military prowess or the virile manhood of an Australian race. One needn't have had a forebear who had fought on the Western Front or at Gallipoli in order to engage with that tradition. Rather, the Anzac legend can be an exclusive and unifying story. It symbolizes an ethos of egalitarianism and mateship that animates our national life. It serves to remind us that when we are at our best, we are prepared to think about something greater than ourselves, to place duty above interest." He had written that article, which appeared in The Australian at the time of the 2010 Anzac Day commemorations. It was part of more than 4 full pages of that newspaper devoted to the event. How different to 1975, when that same newspaper had had only one solitary article about the day. That had been the nadir of Anzac Day. In modern times, the iconoclasm of the 60s and 70s had taken a dreadful toll. Indeed, it was a toll more dreadful than I think we ever realized for a long time, for it became tied up with a confusion of issues that led to the shameful national embarrassment upon the return of the Vietnam veterans. That war, where our involvement had been born out of political cynicism, and yet which saw the Anzac spirit in battles such as Long Tan, not only failed in its political objectives, it also very sadly failed for a long time the Australian soldiers, conscript and volunteer, who had fought in it. From their own words, we have heard how they had felt that they were being held to blame for the bad political decisions of government in fighting that unjust war. Over the years, when I've recounted my own experiences as an anti-war activist, I've told stories of the threats that we received and sometimes actual physical violence at the hands of a few pro-war extremists at the time. It was therefore profoundly disconcerting to me subsequently to hear stories of what some former Vietnam veterans had had to endure from some anti-war sympathizers. Waiting for my turn to be interviewed on Peter Gurr's program one night in 2008, I sat listening to 2 vets who told of how they and others had been reviled in the street when in uniform back in the early 1970s. I had had no idea that this had ever happened, and I was, and I am, ashamed to think that it had. Anzac Day reached its low point in terms of public support after the fall of Saigon. Maybe it was then that Alf Cook should have shouted, "That's my day, that's the old digger's day." for nobody else seemed to want to know them at the time. Hopefully, today's popularity today is a proclamation that the existential mateship Australian soldiers encountered in battle has truly made it Australia's Day.